All right, hi seniors. I'm going to go over chapters 5 through 10 in Frankenstein. And I'm going to do it kind of quickly because these ones are a lot plot based. We'll talk more about that last chapter and some little things that you might have missed. But for the most part, I'm going to cruise through this. It was a lot of reading, but it's easier to follow than previous assignments. So the monster wakes up, dreary November evening. You guys did a close read of this part, so I'm not going to go over it in a lot of detail, but you probably noticed all the references to like light and dullness and that sort of like contrast between what he expected and this spark of life and then like the dull eyes, the yellow skin of the creature. So he's horrified, to put it shortly. He goes to his room and he can't sleep. He's tossing and turning, and the monster comes and like lifts the curtain to be like, "Hey, what's up? You made me, now what?" And Frankenstein, the scientist, because we know now Frankenstein is the scientist, he can't be bothered to deal with this monster, so he goes and paces in the garden all night. The next day he leaves his house, where he runs into his friend Henry Clerval. They go back to his house and he's like, hopefully the monster is gone. And it is. So he's super neglectful of this thing that he's just spent 2 years creating, which we can talk about. But then he falls ill for the entire winter. It's not until spring that he finally starts to feel better. And at the end of the chapter, Clerval's like, "Hey, why don't you write your father and cousin a letter?" So chapter 6, he gets a letter from Elizabeth, who we learn all about the family. So Ernest is their 16-year-old brother. Elizabeth, if you remember, is his cousin sister. Ernest is going to join the military. That's his plan. We learn that they have another little tiny cute brother named William, and this girl Justine Moritz, who it seems like Elizabeth is going on a tangent about who she is, but we need this information for the next chapters, as you now know. So Justine Moritz is this girl who lived with their family for a while, then she went back and lived with her mother until her mother died, and now she is again living with the Frankenstein family. Very fond of the family and especially of their late mother. She says some gossip. Frankenstein visits his old professors, but he wants nothing to do with science anymore. So he studies with Clerval, and he studies the Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit languages, and sort of more Eastern literature, which he finds soothing. Yep, that's chapter 6. Chapter 7, he gets a letter. William, the cutest and smallest of the Frankenstein family, of course, has been murdered. So he's been strangled. This is important and it's easy to miss. Elizabeth blames herself because that day that he was killed, she gave him this little brooch with a picture of his mother that he's wearing. And then after he's murdered, it's been taken off his body. So she blames herself and attributes theft as the motive of the murderer. So he introduces this idea of death as peace, which he goes into even further with the next chapters, which we'll talk about. So he's on his way back to Geneva to visit his family after William has been murdered. And this is like over a year after he creates his monster. So he creates his monster in November. He falls sick that winter. He gets better in the spring, but then he studies Oriental languages for like a year with Clerval. So this is the following spring. He still didn't go back to see his family. So he's finally back. But it's night. The gates of Geneva are closed, so he's like, well, I'm going to go wander this beautiful scenery. Okay, so he's going on this walk, and to see Mont Blanc, which is this huge mountain in the Swiss Alps, that Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley's husband, has actually wrote a famous poem on. I think it's just called Mont Blanc. And there's something that's important to know at this point, which is the idea of the sublime. And what the sublime is, it's this concept we see in romantic literature, but it's really all over. And it has to do with how humans perceive nature. And this idea of the sublime is this feeling, but it's sort of it's not easily definable or easily graspable to the human mind, but it's this idea that nature is both like beautiful and inspiring, but also sort of like powerful and awesome and dangerous and just larger than we have the capacity to understand. So it's like this mix of like beauty and danger and power. So he describes these mountains in the thunderstorm, a lot of sublime romanticism here. And then he sees, let me find the quote. He's mourning William. William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this thy dirge. As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me, its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. So he sees this demon that he's convinced it's his monster. He sees him like scaling this mountain, which just sort of goes to show you how sort of beyond human, superhuman this creation is. He doesn't chase him because he's like, I could never catch him. But he realizes like, oh my God, he killed William. He's certain of it. But he decides that he's not going to tell his family about this because he feels like they would just attribute it to his period of illness and be like, he's gone completely crazy now. And he learns that Justine Moritz, this girl that has stayed with the family, has been accused of the crime. Elizabeth doesn't believe it. Okay, chapter 9. No. Oh, God, 8. We're only on 8. I think it's the trial. Yeah, the trial. I'll let you guys read it. It's pretty easy to follow. Elizabeth's appeal. So Justine says that basically she's been out searching for William. She slept in a barn. She woke up and she had this brooch. She doesn't know how she got it. But this is why people think she's the murderer, because she has this brooch. Then Elizabeth sort of testifies on Justine's behalf. Everyone is against Justine. They think she murdered William. And Elizabeth's testimony doesn't even help. It says, a murmur of approbation followed Elizabeth's simple and powerful appeal, but it was excited by her generous interference and not in favor of poor Justine, on whom the public indignation was turned with renewed violence. So Elizabeth gives this speech and people are like, oh my God, Elizabeth is so kind and trusting. Like, we hate this woman even more for deceiving her. So, doesn't help. Let's see. Justine Moritz confesses, but we learn that it's because of her confessor. Ever since I was condemned, my confessor has besieged me. He threatened me and menaced until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. He threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments if I continued obdurate. So basically she says, I confessed because this guy was sort of pushing me so much. we can assume her mental state is not great. This guy might be using light torture, because she's obviously not sleeping. She's not in a great place. So she confesses, and she is put to death. And there's a lot of... Frankenstein feels mostly sorry for himself at this point, because again, we see this idea of death, and Justine gets death, and it's sort of peace. But he's the one that really suffers, according to him. The poor victim, who on the morrow was to pass the awful boundary between life and death, felt not as I did such deep and bitter agony. And Justine's sort of very martyr-like, stoic in her last conversation with Frankenstein and Elizabeth. She's the one that ends up comforting them. And again, he says, "But I, the true murderer, felt the never-dying worm alive in my bosom, which allowed of no hope or consolation." So he's like, she has her innocence. I think that's a quote in here, actually. I'll find it. Maybe I skipped past it, but he feels sorry for himself because he knows the truth, and he feels that he cannot tell people because they won't believe him, and even if he did tell them, it wouldn't have saved Justine. So I'm kind of curious to know what you guys think about that, because I see it from his perspective, but it also seems like a cop-out to me. Let's see. So he's sort of struggling with this knowledge after in chapter 9. Doesn't want to see his family because his family's like, why are you like mourning so much? You need to sort of move on with your life. And he can't because he has this knowledge and he's suffering, and then he doesn't want to make his father suffer more by seeing him suffer. Let's see. He thinks about killing himself, but he writes, "I was restrained when I thought of the heroic and suffering Elizabeth, whom I tenderly loved. I thought of my father and surviving brother. Should I by my base desertion leave them exposed and unprotected to the malice of the fiend whom I had let loose among them?" So he decides he can't kill himself because he's worried that his creation will go after his family. I don't know why I highlighted some of these things. He decides to go for a walk in the valley of Chamonix. I think that's how you say it. And leave his family for a while. Just go for this little trip around where he lives, in the Swiss Alps. We again see the sublime. A lot of description of the Swiss Alps on this trip. And we have a really good quote for the sublime. "There, peeping forth from among the trees, formed a scene of singular beauty, but it was augmented and rendered sublime," we even have the word, "by the mighty Alps, whose white and shining pyramids and domes towered above all, as belonging to another earth, the habitations of another race of beings." So again, he's in awe. Nature sort of takes his mind off of what's gone down to some extent. And again, we have sleep compared to death and peace. "When I placed my head upon my pillow," at the very end of this chapter, "sleep crept over me. I felt it as it came, and blessed the giver of oblivion." So we can see this longing for nothingness, which sort of becomes a recurring idea throughout this. Okay, chapter 10. He's still on this trip through this valley to get his mind off things. We have more descriptions of the beautiful and powerful scenery. And then he decides to climb to the summit of Montanvert. He sees. It's like probably midway through the chapter. I suddenly beheld a figure of a man at some distance advancing towards me with superhuman speed. Who is it but his creation? And then they have this really, I love the interchange between them, this conversation. Frankenstein is like, I want to kill you, essentially. And his creature, I'm going to read this whole quote because it's really great. I expected this reception, said the demon. All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. So he's saying we're bound to each other, and these ties will only dissolve, will only come apart when one of us is destroyed, because you made me, man. So there's this great irony here that the creature we don't know what he's been up to for 2 years. We'll find out. But he's sort of calling Frankenstein out, like, everyone hates me, but you hating me is the worst of all. You made me. And he says, you propose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? And that's a question. Why is that ironic? Because he means, how dare you, like, play thus with life? But we see, like, Frankenstein played with life when he was creating this thing, and clearly he didn't take it seriously, right? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace, but if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death. Maw is a jaw, until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. So he's like, do what I say, or I'll kill all your friends and family. And then Frankenstein sort of like jumps to attack him. And the creature's like, calm down, little man. And this is probably my favorite quote in the whole chapter, or the whole book. He's saying, like, don't, like, calm down. And then he says, life, although it may only be an accumulation of anguish, is dear to me, and I will defend it. So the monster has clearly suffered, calls himself wretched, miserable beyond all living things. But he's willing to defend what terrible little life he has. I really like that quote. And then again, down here at the bottom of this same paragraph, remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, referring to Adam and Eve, which would make Frankenstein God. But I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. So he's making this illusion, like, I am Adam, you are God, you made me. Now help me to be happy. And again, we have to ask ourselves, what does Frankenstein owe? Or what does Frankenstein owe his creation? He brought him into the world, he abandoned him. And we can compare this to a metaphor of a parent, of an artist creating something. He uses the metaphor of God creating man. The title of the novel is Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. So, and then there are tons of metaphors that have been made with this novel, which is why it's so lasting in its influence. But now he's directly asking him, like, you made me, you were responsible in some way for my happiness and my morality and teaching me how to be in the world. Let's see. lots of good quotes here, but I'm going to jump to the end since we're about at 20 minutes. He asks him to listen to him, and then he can decide what to do, but that's all he asks of him right now. You need to listen to my story, which is the best part of the novel. So we're going to hear from the creation in the next chapter. Frankenstein agrees to listen. For the first time also I felt what the duties of a creator towards his creature were, and that I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. So he's like, essentially I owe this creation at least an ear to hear what he has to say. So that's in the preceding chapters, and it's the best because the creature is so eloquent, and we get to see like how he's been spending his time for the past 2 years. This is my favorite part of the novel coming up. Okay. That was a lot. I breezed through the first few chapters. But we'll talk about this in our Zoom tomorrow and surely refer back to it as we continue reading. So that's all I have for you guys. Thanks for watching. Bye.